To this special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos, and we are live from outside the CBC Broadcasting Centre in Toronto, bringing you extensive coverage of the Ontario election. By the end of today, Ontario is expected to have a new premier. Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne conceded defeat this week, and polls suggest a virtual tie between the PC's Doug Ford and the NDP's Andrea Horwath, at least with popular support. The entire nation is watching because this isn't just about Ontario. The conclusion will have far-reaching consequences for a federation that right now is kind of fractured over pipelines and climate policy. So what is at stake here for Canada? The Premier's League is back for another round. From Vancouver, we're joined by former BC Premier Ujjal Dosanjh. In Saskatoon, former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, now Special Advisor at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt LLP. And with me here in Toronto, former Ontario Premier David Peterson, Chairman Emeritus and Senior Counsel at Castles Brocklers. Hi again, everyone. Thanks again. Mr. Dosanjh, why don't I start with you, because we've discussed a few times on the show already how fractured the relationship is in certain parts of this country between the provinces and the federal government. What does a Doug Ford government, Doug Ford-led government in Ontario mean for the federal Liberals from your vantage point?
Well, I think it means some trouble on the environment file. Obviously, the planning that and the policy that Mr. Trudeau is following in terms of the carbon tax is going to face some resistance if Mr. Ford is the premier. If the NDP, on the other hand, wins the election, Mr. Trudeau's life might be a little easier on some of these policies. In terms of the pipeline, I mean, that issue it won't be impacted by whether or not you have Doug Ford or Andrea Horwath. But the carbon issue absolutely will be impacted, and in fact it might become slightly more difficult to govern in terms of the federal, provincial premiers and first ministers conferences with Doug Ford, who sometimes is you can't tell what he's going to do. He's unpredictable. So going into federal, provincial conferences or first ministers' conferences, there might be a great deal of uncertainty as to where Ontario might stand. And I think that is not good for the Federation. Not to say that I'm a partisan, but the federal government and the provinces need to be able to work on these very important issues in somewhat of a non-partisan way.
Mr. Peterson, let me ask you, as a former premier of this province, the biggest economy, the most populous province, how significant is it on to the country as a whole? How this election?
It is extremely significant, and here's why: there's no other federation in the world where one piece is so important, 40% of the GDP, and it's one of the most jurisdiction that's diverse in its responsibilities. So they have so much. The provinces have so much power. When I was here, I spent a great deal of time building relationships with Quebec, with Ottawa, and with my friends in the West, with Don Getty, and with Grant Devine, and others, and Bill Bennett. And these were great Canadians. And even Peter Lougheed, who was there, he was a local guy, but he never forgot the national interest. And I think how this is approached, and the size of the hearts and the understanding of the needs and pressures in this great country are going to be really strained in the next little while. And I really hope they can all step up to it. Look what's happening out west now. It's sad for the country what's happening. And I get it, I'm not getting into the issues here, but let me just say, if we can't find answers, we're going to put pressures on this confederation like we've never had before.
Mr. Wall, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree. There's pressures coming on the Federation, notwithstanding the result tonight in Ontario, but certainly the Ontario election will play a part in informing the intensity, I guess, of that tension, of that stress. We also have an Alberta election coming up probably within a year, and we have the equalization debate or discussion that looms as that federal program needs to be renewed, and I think those are all pressure points that are upcoming. I just say this about tonight's election. I mean, obviously, I think as your viewers will know that Saskatchewan is the holdout on the carbon tax, and my successor, Premier Moe, has indicated that continues to be the position of the province of Saskatchewan, and if need be, will go to court. There haven't been a lot of allies on that position, admittedly so, around the table. That could change tonight. there could be a very powerful ally. David's appropriately canvassed the influence of Ontario and the Federation, not just economically, but in terms of politics and the Federation itself. And based on what Ford has said during the campaign, Saskatchewan might expect to have an ally in that court case, if it comes to that, against the federal government carbon tax, and maybe another one in just less than a year when the Alberta situation may or may not change, I guess. I would also offer this thought. Regardless of whether or not it's Premier Horwath or Premier Ford tonight, Ontarians will have weighed in on a pretty important issue in the election campaign, and that is the issue of environmental policy and its impact on families and businesses vis-a-vis electricity rates. Because we all want to get to the point where energy's cleaner. There's no doubt about it. Whether you support a carbon tax or not, we want to get to the point where where renewables, where clean energy is the baseload energy for the world. That should be the focus of everybody. But if you move precipitously on that front, there's an impact, a policy impact, and one that will hit the voters, one that hits families in terms of the rates that they pay for electricity there in Ontario or anywhere else, and it hurts your competitiveness potentially in the short, the midterm, and possibly the long term. Now, the architect for some of this policy anyway would have been an advisor to Mr. Premier McGuinty, Gerald Butts. He's the advisor to the Prime Minister today, and much of what we see from the current federal government, I think, is similar to what we saw in Ontario years ago that's led to this point. And so I think the election tonight is informative about the impact politics of some of the ideas that we've seen even imposed federally, but certainly it'll tell us a lot about how voters in Ontario feel about the impact of environmental policy in their province.
But Brad, can I say something? And I do believe this. I believe as Ontario, as the biggest and the richest, has the biggest responsibility to reach out and assist the smooth functioning of this confederation. I think we have more responsibility than some of the smaller provinces that don't have the economic might. But at the same time, this depends on the quality of the people that are coming forward, who reflect their electorates, who believe at the end of the day this federation is worth fighting for. I saw it, interesting enough, in the original Meech Lake discussions in 1987, 1990, when I saw acts of leadership of Don Getty and Michael Harcourt and Grant Devine, that people were yelling at them all the time. They could have easily turned on those situations, but they put the interest of the nation first. So our Prime Minister is going to have to call on the best instincts of these guys, these people who were ever elected, and they have a responsibility to think of the Confederation as well.
Mr. Desange, the last word to you.
I think David makes a great point. I think in the past, historically, Ontario has stood for the Federation in a much more dignified way that has brought the country together. Vis-a-vis Quebec, I think Ontario has always been at the center of negotiations to keep Quebec with us. And I think whoever wins is going to have that responsibility going forward on many of these issues the Federation faces.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. Thanks to the Premiers League, Ujjal Desange, Brad Wall, and David Peterson.
Fun to be with you guys.
Thanks, David. See you, Vassy.
See ya. Indigenous